Okay, well, welcome everybody. I'm really excited that you are here. And I'm sure a lot of you are employees who are trying to manage your health condition at work. Um, and I wrote a book about this. So let me tell you a little bit about my story. I have had a health condition for a very long time. Did not find out that I had Lyme disease until I was 37 years old. So I've worked in HR for over 20 years. And of course, I hid it like most people do because I was afraid of the way people would treat me, how they would react to me. I watched my aunt who has post polio syndrome, and I've seen what she went through growing up. So there was a lot of fear about, divulging my own health condition. But what happened was in 2004, I got in a car wreck going to a client site. And so I was rear ended. It exacerbated my health condition. I had a very complicated situation because this was a work related accident. I had to take leave. I had to go part time for a while. I had to get a new desk. I had to get a new chair because all my migraine was exacerbated, chronic pain, fatigue, everything. So here I am. I'm the one that's supposed to be helping employers and employees with ADA accommodations, and here I'm having to ask for it. It was a very humbling experience. I got to really see how terrifying it is, right? And I realized too that I had really actually had a really good employer and they really worked with me, but it was still very difficult because I could tell they were still navigating the ADA. And this is before the amendment came out. So this was in 2004. And I also didn't really know as much as I thought I did. And I realized I needed to know more. So this put me on a whole big journey of deciding to specialize in the ADA. So I got my master's in dispute resolution and conflict management. I got certified as an ADA coordinator. And then I realized, like, I'm looking at this information. I'm like, well, how does an employee figure out how to request an accommodation? Like, what the law is it? Because they need to know their rights, but they also need to know their employers. Because a lot of the lawsuits I'm seeing, there's like 32% are disability. A lot of it is just misinformation. Both sides don't really understand it. But I realize this is one of those laws that employees really do need to understand it. It really takes a lot of effort on the employee side to really make this work. So I realized I needed to write a book. I mean, I felt very empowered to write the book and to make it as simple as possible. I had a great editor, of course. I'm not a writer, that's not my, but I wanted to get this information out. I wanted something everyone could just, go through and work through. So the book, just to kind of explain to you how big of research is, my book is very big. It's not meant to read from cover, front to back. It's a resource. And then there's actually a workbook that goes with it that you can actually download. You don't have to buy the workbook, but it's to help you when you're researching and trying to request an accommodation. So the more that I did it, the more I realized, wow, thought I knew all this stuff, right? Now I got all this education, but it was the book that really helped me to figure out how I needed to help other people. So, okay, so go ahead and we can start the slides.
Alrighty.
Yep.
Wait for it. There we go. Let me
Okay.
get through these. Okay.
Okay, so this is just the front of the presentation, kind of what I was just talking about. I try to make the book available through all different ways because depending on what your disability is or how you access information over the internet, I have all types of ebooks and print you can get on Amazon. But anyway, so that's just some information about that. And then so go please next slide, please.
Is that working?
Next slide.
Okay. Is it moving for you? What are you seeing on your end?
I'm just seeing the first one, making it work. The first
Oh,
slide.
okay. Well, it's not working then.
Try the slideshow. Can you click on the slideshow?
Uh, yeah, let's do that. Did that move it?
It moved it too much. I need to go back to the second slide.
Back to the second slide. And is everybody else seeing the same thing? It's just staying stuck on the first one. Is that right?
It's actually stuck on the third one.
Mm.
Try clicking slideshow again because it should turn into just a full screen of the slideshow.
And
Oh, you know what?
that's what it's doing.
Okay, did you
Oh.
hit enable editing? Maybe that's why. I don't know.
I just did. Let's see what kind of difference that makes. Did we break
Okay.
through?
Perfect. So you're on the second slide. Okay.
Oh my goodness, we did it.
Okay, so of course I have to do the legal disclaimer as an HR person. I have to let you know that this material is for education purposes only. I'm not a lawyer. It's not legal advice. So that's just a disclaimer I have to do. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's first, so I'm going to start, I'm going to go from the big picture down to the employment part because I think it's important to understand kind of where employment fits with this. So the ADA was passed in 1990. It was made to make American society more accessible to people with disabilities. And then in 2008 is when they passed the amendment that interpreted disability in favor of a broad range of individuals with medical conditions, and that disability should be construed broadly. This is really important part of the amendment. A lot of people think that when they think of disability, they think of someone in a wheelchair, someone who is blind or deaf. But this amendment has changes to people that have all sorts of medical conditions that are impacted by major life activities. And we're going to go more deeply, but that's a really important part. So what this did, this changed the way employers had to look at the ADA, how they used to look at the ADA in 1990 to even 2004 when I was in the car wreck, was they were defining whether you had a disability or not. I mean, you couldn't even get to the accommodation part. They were defining, you were still through that, where with the amendment, they're focusing on whether there's a reasonable accommodation they can implement in order to either keep you at work or return you to work. Okay, so that's an important part. So anyways, and the next thing, civil rights law. This is a civil rights law, and that's something a lot of people don't know. So it protects individuals with disabilities just like any other, like age, sex, race, national origin, etc. It's still a work in progress. Real important about this, the ADA is still evolving. There's a lot of more detailed information out there about the ADA, but as the courts interpret the ADA through lawsuits and stuff, we're going to get more clarification. And then you have different regions of courts and different sections that are interpreting different parts of the law. But this foundation I'm giving you is something to work from, and it's not something you need to worry about, but I just want you to know that it's still evolving. And there are 5 titles of the ADA that covers non-discrimination against people with disabilities. The one we're going to be talking about is employment. Now, the one thing I do want to point out, though, on the miscellaneous title, this is where a state or local government can actually expand ADA coverage for other people, for more people, or for different types of individuals. So we're going to talk about how it provides greater protections later on. That's really important to pay attention to in the state you are. Okay, next slide, please. And if you have me look down, I'm actually looking at my notes to make sure I cover everything. So we're going to define Title I of the ADA. So it protects individuals with ADA disabilities. I call it IWD, from harassment, being fired, discipline for asserting your rights under the ADA. One of the things I do want you to see is, and I think I just may have told you, but I call it an ADA disability instead of disability. I want people to start thinking differently about how the ADA interprets disability. So that's why you hear me say ADA disability instead of disability. So anyway, and the next thing is it provides individuals with disability the right to request a reasonable accommodation, the most important thing. It protects individuals in all areas of employment. So this means, they can't discriminate against you when they're recruiting somebody, or they can't decide not to hire you because you have a disability, or to pay you less because you have a disability, or not to promote you because they fear that your disability is going to get worse. And the ADA covers employers with 15 or more employees. This includes state and local governments, also employment agencies. A lot of people don't know that, staffing firms, labor unions. And so many states actually expand coverage to organizations with less than 15 employees. This is where the state law, ADA laws come into play, disability laws. So if, let's say I'm in Washington State, well, if an employer has 8 or more employees, then they are covered under the ADA. They have to comply with the ADA. If you're in Alaska and Hawaii, it's actually, if you have 1 or more employees, you have to consider reasonably accommodating an individual. So look at your state. If you just look up disability and your state, it'll come up. So look at your state, see if there's anything unique within your state. And also, a lot of people have asked before, it's like, well, what about federal employees? Well, they're covered under the Rehabilitation Act, but it's pretty much the same thing. It's almost exactly like the ADA. It just falls under the Rehabilitation Act. Another important thing is that the ADA is supposed to be applied individually, it's fact specific and case by case basis. That means when you request an accommodation, they can't look at you and say, oh, well, she has lupus, so the other employee I had that had lupus, she's going to need the same thing, or she's going to go through the same thing. Everyone's different. They have to look at you and individually assess your situation, your job responsibilities and the demands of your work and what you need. You can't be based on assumption or opinions or ideas or past experience. They really have to focus on your particular situation. And sometimes that's hard to do, right? And we'll talk about whether you choose to give your disability, tell them what your diagnosis are, if you want to tell them a physical or mental impairment. I'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, so next slide, please. A definition of a person with an ADA disability. So this is someone has a current. When I say current, that means that it's always there's always issues with their physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. Like someone with dyslexia, they're always having challenges with dyslexia, heart disease, bipolar disorder, persons with diabetes. There's thousands of physical and mental impairments, but those are ones that that currently give you challenges all the time. Or if you're in a wheelchair, you probably have challenges getting in and out, or physical areas. So a person with a history is someone who has cancer, like that's in remission. Okay, so it's not actually active right now, but you've had cancer and you've had medical treatment, and they can't discriminate against you because of that. Another one that most people don't know about is having a history of episodic symptoms. So episodic symptoms goes under the history of an impairment. That means that you have a chronic health condition like epilepsy, MS, lupus, fibromyalgia. Those, you don't always have health issues, right? So I have Lyme disease, but it's more like fibromyalgia type stuff. So I have flare-ups, right? So that's where I have a history. So it's episodic. I may only need accommodations ever so often. Now, the third prong is a little bit more confusing. It's when an organization or your employer perceives you as having an impairment you don't have. So let's say that you were an employee that had knee surgery, and you were cleared. Your doctor said, now you're great. You can do everything, run, hike, do whatever. But your manager perceives you as still having an ADA disability, and let's say decides not to promote you because he thinks that you're not going to, and you're a supervisor at a warehouse, and he thinks because you're going to be walking the warehouse, well, you can't do it because of your knee. Well, in that case, that's perceiving you as having an AD disability that you don't have. Another thing I want to define is what major life activities. For those that I hear some of you guys work for CFI at Center for Independent Living, they talk about activities of daily living, ADL. That's the same thing, but it's basic activities that most people can perform with little or no difficulty. That's sitting, walking, concentrating, lifting, standing, communicating. I mean, there's hundreds of them, but it's anything you do day to day with little or no difficulty. And then the ADA actually amended this to include majorly bodily functions. So what does that mean? To include major bodily functions? That means like your immune system. Your immune system, it doesn't work like everyone else's. So that may be somebody with ulcerative colitis. It might be somebody with respiratory issues, asthma, or pancreas, diabetes. It's when their organs don't work like everyone else's does in general, right? And then everybody's like, oh my gosh, but I don't know if my, if the major life activity I'm having problems with is substantially limited. You don't need to worry about that, because what you just have to compare to is the general population. So let's say that most people can walk a block without getting out of breath or being in pain, you're not going to compare yourself to, let's say I'm 50, so another 50-year-old. You're going to compare yourself to a general population, and the general population can walk a block without getting out of breath or being in pain. So you'd be substantially limited. You don't have to be significantly or severely limited in order to qualify, okay? So I hope that helps a little bit clarify some of the definition of ADA disability. So now let's say you follow.
I want
Sorry?
to stop for just a sec. The
Yeah.
interpreter is here. So if anybody wants
okay.
the interpreter, pin the interpreter. It says interpreter Michelle. So just pin her and then she will stay in your screen.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, so next slide, please. So now that you know you have an ADA disability, what makes you qualified with an ADA disability? So this means that you need to have the skills, experience, and education and other job-related requirements in order to do the job, right? And this is with or without accommodation. So you still have to be able to do the job. So an employer doesn't have to hire an employee if they can't do the job, regardless of whether they have a disability or not. And they must be able to perform the essential functions of the job, of the position, with or without an accommodation. So what is essential? That's the main functions, right? So these is why the position exists in the first place. I'm going to give you an example. Like, let's say a customer service representative. The essential functions of a customer service representative is to interact with customers on behalf of the organization. So that means they need to provide information about products and services to customers. They need to take orders. They need to respond to customer complaints, and they need to process returns. Those are the fundamental functions. You need to be able to do that with or without an accommodation, okay? And a lot of times on the job description now, they'll say essential functions, or they'll say main functions or fundamental functions. So that's where you'll find that. And then the other parts, what are not main functions, are called marginal functions. And you don't really need to worry about the name of what it means, but it's just incidental things that most employees can be able to do, right? That can, help out. So a lot of times it's lifting. A lot of people have lifting restrictions, and let's say the UPS driver at the customer service center, comes in and, customer service reps, pick up the boxes. And let's say because of your limitation, your functional limitation, you're not able to do that. Well, you can request that you don't lift those boxes because it's a functional limitation that you have, and it's a marginal function, and other people can do it. So when you're looking at accommodations, you can look at that also, is maybe there's some things you can eliminate and actually replace with something else. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. So now let's talk about what is a reasonable accommodation. So it is it's a request for either a change or something in the work environment, or to make changes in the working conditions that are related to your medical condition, okay? So there are three types. There are modifications or adjustments to the job application process. So this is applying for the job, request an accommodation to apply for the job or interview, or to do the application test that some people require. So for example, a deaf individual needs a sign language interpreter maybe for the interview, or someone in a wheelchair may be able not to access the building in which they do the interview, so needs a request that they meet in a different location so they can access the interview. The one that you hear the most common is to modification or adjustment to the essential functions of the job. Remember, these are the fundamental functions. So I'm going to give you an example. So let's say a cashier with MS requests a reasonable accommodation because she is having difficulty standing for 8 hours a day because of her neuropathy pain. She is limited in standing for long periods of time. So she requests an accommodation that limits the amount of time she stands, but where she can still take care of her customers and cashier, because that's an essential job function. So in that case, the employer would look to see what type of accommodations may enable her to rest, right, while she's still cashiering. And so there's things such as leaning stools, or just an actual stool that she could sit on, and rest in between, taking care of customers. So that would be how she could still perform the essential functions of her job. The third one, a lot of people are actually surprised about, and I was actually when I really got into this, the ADA, was that it allowing an employee, an individual with a disability, to enjoy benefits and privileges of employment equal to those enjoyed by those without disability. So what does that mean? That means that so they can they can access the building, right? So if they can't get into the building, they need to be able to get in the building. And let's say they can't use stairs. Well, they need to have access to the building, and that's their right and privilege to be able to access the building. Or they need the bathrooms widened so that they could get the wheelchair in there. Or like with my aunt, she needs bars because, to be able to sit or position herself when she's in the restroom. Or to even attend conferences, like somebody with hearing impaired may need closed captioning, or even to participate in training programs. And these are even voluntary training programs. So you have the right, just like anybody else, and you may need an accommodation to attend that training program. And so someone with low vision may need large print material, or even attend a workplace party. So let's say you have a workplace party. My boyfriend has celiac. He has to have gluten-free food, and he has to have very clean gluten-free food. So, the employer would be obligated to make sure that he has gluten-free food available. So the ADA is designed to remove or mitigate physical, social, and environmental barriers. So there's two types. There is the workplace barriers. This is the inability to access the bathroom because the doorway is too narrow, or the doorknobs are difficult to grasp. Another functional barrier would be having the difficulty to hear what's being discussed in meetings, or having difficulty viewing computer screens, or difficulty communicating and writing. You can see how this can affect a lot of people, right? A lot of people have health conditions. Not everybody needs a reasonable accommodation at work. It really depends on your job and your position, your organization. So you may look at somebody and say, oh yeah, they definitely need a reasonable accommodation. Well, that's not necessarily true. It really has to do with their job and their building and access and that sort of thing. I just want to make that clear. Next slide, please. So we're just going to go over, there are millions of types of reasonable accommodations, okay? And I'm kind of plug my book here because I do go into a lot of different types of reasonable accommodations. The reason I do that is there's a couple that you really need to prepare, especially like telework when you're talking to your employer, to kind of really sell them on how you would be able to work from home. So there is some, or service animals, that's another one you really need to do your homework and present it and really kind of evaluate and help your employer with that. So, and reasonable accommodations are going to be different for different people, again, even if you have the same medical condition. Okay, so acquiring and modifying equipment or devices, this is probably one of the most common ones. Like I'm wearing a headset. Some people can't hold the phone because they have neck issues or fatigue and stuff. A lot of people, but there are people that don't have health conditions that still do better with headsets. And you'll find that too, is that you'll start asking for the accommodations, and then you'll have coworkers like, wow, that would really help me if I use that. So it becomes very inclusive and universal. It's kind of surprising. Sometimes having a health condition or just ADA disability, you really find creative ways that actually works better for a lot of people. So sit stand decks are real common, but now they have the ones that are a little bit cheaper, that there's something that you can put on the desk so you can lift and lower your computer, or so you can stand. Screen reader software is really used a lot for people with fatigue or learning disabilities. Magnification software to help people with low vision. Making workplace readily accessible to people and usable by people with disabilities. Again, that's accessible parking, break rooms, being able to get and navigate into the break rooms. Increased lighting for people with low vision or visual impairments. Adjusting or modifying examinations. So if you're having to take some sort of exam, you may need more time if you have a learning disability, or you need training material that needs to be large print or needs to be on the computer versus print because you can see easier on the computer. Also policies. This is really important that they don't ever have to eliminate policies. We'll talk more about that later, but they may have to modify a policy. Let's say in general that you don't supposed to have food at the desk. Well, if you're an employee with diabetes, you need to have food at your workstation or something close around so that you need to eat when you have to. Break policies. Most companies have break policies, but if you are a person with diabetic, you may need to test your blood sugar every 2 hours, and you may need 5 minutes to do that. One that's really common is modifying attendant policies, because let's say someone who has seizures, well, those seizures shouldn't account against their attendance policy, right? Because that has to do with their health condition, not not being able to attend. Job restructuring. So the job restructuring is where these marginal functions can be eliminated or replaced with other marginal duties. So I'm going to give you an example. Remember the cashier I was talking about? Well, she cannot stock shelves because it requires her to bend, lift, and stock shelves. So this requires a lot of, up and down and moving and pulling and stuff. So she asked that that be eliminated. And what I suggest to you is if you're asking for something to be eliminated, see if there's other ways you can help your team members. In this case, she can wipe down, the cashier counters and answer the phones while the other cashiers are stocking, and they only do it 15 minutes a day. So it's not like this essential thing that they have to do. It's marginal, right? But I always say, show that you're working as a team. You're trying to strategize as much as them. You're trying to help them out, right? Modifying work schedule is probably one of the most common. People have doctor's appointments. So, sometimes they need to come in a little bit later and leave a little bit later, or come in a little bit earlier, but you have to still be able to do your essential functions. So sometimes your main functions have to be done at a certain time. So in that case, it's going to affect how you're able to modify your schedule. Telework. It's called telework, remote work, work from home. I think I've heard work from WFH is a new one I've heard. So a lot of people who have disabilities that are at higher risk of getting the COVID-19 are actually wanting to work from home, sometimes full time. It's going to really depend, right? So because you have to be able to do the essential job functions. Remember, these are the main functions. You're going to hear me say that a lot because that's real critical. You have to be able to do that from home. So in some cases, people will work. Most time it's not full time. It's usually part time. You 2 or 3 days you're able to work from home, especially if you're working with customers. So if you are working for customers and you need to be one-on-one with them, then that's probably not going to be one you can work from home. It's going to really depend. I'm not going to jump and say what your job you can and cannot do from home. But again, I hate to keep plugging my book, but in there I actually give you the information of things to consider and how to approach your employer if that is something you want to do and you think you can do from home, and that'll help them out too. Because they're still trying to navigate the work from home too. Believe me, I just went through a training earlier today about that. So medical leave, pretty common. There's a lot of, if you're with a company with 50 or more employees, then, you fall under FMLA, but some companies actually have personal leave. If your employer doesn't, then you have, sick leave or you have PTO that you can use. But let's say you have to go beyond what that protected leave is, then that's called extended leave under the ADA. And it depends. Each court district is determining how much that is. What's coming out, it's probably 2 or 3 weeks, seems to be reasonable as extended leave. It really depends on your job and if it's affecting the company for you to be gone that long. So it's really going to be individualized again. You have to look at your position, but realize that having extended leave, there's no such thing as unlimited leave. You just can't take months off and because of your health condition. So something to take in mind. Let's say that there is an accommodation that's going to work in your current position. Then the other option is reassignment to a vacant position. The important thing to know about that is you have to be qualified for that vacant position. And let's say that there isn't a position that's equivalent to the position you currently have. And let's say it's a lower position and it pays lower. Your employer only has to pay you for what that position is. I just had an employee kind of get upset because she said, I'm a physical therapist and they just offered me a physical therapist assistant job and it only pays $16 an hour. And I said, well, is that the only position available there? Are there any other locations that have that? And she said, no. And I was like, well, that's why they offered it, because that's all they have to offer you. And they don't have to offer her at the current, amount. But I think it's important to understand that because she got really offended thinking that, it was something about her that they offered her that position. It wasn't. That's just all they had to offer. But sometimes you may have a skill set that they didn't even know you have. So make sure you do, a lot of discussions with your employer, and it can be at a different location, but they don't have to cover your relocation costs unless they cover it for other people. Okay. So you have to look at that policy for that. Change in supervisor methods. You can request, that if your manager normally tells you everything verbally and you need it in writing because it helps you understand better and to be able to take care of your work, then you need to, you can request that. Okay. Next slide, please. I'm already getting behind. I thought I had this short enough. So this is really important. What is not a reasonable accommodation? And this is so important because I think that as important is it to know what is reasonable, what is not. So it's never meant to justify or compensate for a person's lack of knowledge, skills, or ability necessary to succeed in that job. That's really important to understand because I know that I've had some miscommunication with a lot of employees on that. And they do not have to remove or eliminate an essential job function. So so let's say somebody works on the engine of cars in low task areas of a car, for example, and they have lower back pain and bending restrictions. You still have to work on the engine of the car in those task areas, but the employer would be obligated to look at what type of accommodations or modifications would enable the employee to work on the engines without exacerbating the back pain and complying with the doctor's notes that outline the work restrictions. So in this place, the employer would look at, well, what would work? Well, low task chair would work, or a creeper designed to support the body when accessing the engine. So, sometimes you have to get really creative, right? I didn't even know there was such a thing as a creeper designed to support the body when accessing the engine. It's amazing what's out there. I mean, this is a great time to request an accommodation because the technology and the stuff out there is amazing. When you really start talking, that there is ways to do things, but sometimes it takes a lot of creativity and research. They never have to lower production standards. So if an employee has to make 12 sales calls a day, then the employer is not obligated to permanently reduce your production standard to 5 sales calls a day. Okay, they may do it on a temporary basis. Let's say you're getting medical treatment and you're recovering and it's taking you time. They can give you a couple weeks to a month, to get back up to those 12 sales calls. Or let's say you went on pregnancy disability leave and you're returning and you're recovering, and especially people who are returning from leaves, sometimes it takes quite a while to get back into things. So it would be reasonable to be part-time or to slowly get back into things and adjust, right? Your body's recovering from whatever health condition you have. So it is reasonable to ask for it as a temporary basis, but not as permanent. Changing supervisors, that's never, I'd say 90% of the time, it's never an accommodation that an employer has to provide. The only time I've ever seen the exception to that is if the manager actually reminds the employee with the PTSD of the person that, harassed them or hurt them, right? And so that's the only time I've ever seen where a supervisor needed to be changed. An employer never has to eliminate workplace policies. And this is one I've seen throughout the years, is where a time and attendance policy that, well, I have a disability, and I can, sometimes I just have bad days, and I need to come when I want, when I'm able to, and I have a disability, I can do that. You can't. You have to have some sort of structure in place. You have to be able to communicate, but time and attendance does not need to be eliminated. You can't just come and go as you please. Okay, so next slide, please. So what is the interactive process? So this is important. This is where you could really come into as an employee in the process. So this is the informal dialogue between you and your employer, which you identify the precise limitations that are resulting from your ADA disability, and you talk about potential accommodations that will help you overcome those limitations. Okay, so once you request an accommodation, the employer is obligated to engage in the interactive process. The only exception to not engaging in the interactive process is if it's obvious, right? So let's say that I say, I'm starting to work for a company, they have this really bright light, and I'm like, I get really bad migraines, and that really, triggers it, but I know that a lamp is gonna, help me with those migraines. Well, in that case, you're probably not gonna have to do a lot of negotiations, pretty straightforward, so it's not gonna be this big discussion about what needs to be done. So in that case, they say that's an exception, but they still have to engage with you. And your employer's focus during the interactive process is to find a reasonable accommodation, if there's one available, to implement to help you be more effective at your job and be able to work safely. Both parties, and there's a lot of court cases on this, both parties need to make a good faith effort. What this means is both need to make an honest to goodness effort. That means that if you go to your employer and you request an accommodation and they say, oh, well, that's not going to work. We're not going to be able to accommodate you. Well, that's not a good faith effort, right? They haven't tried to look for ways in which it could work. Or if they try one thing and they go, okay, well, it didn't work, so I'm not going to be able to accommodate you. Again, they need to look, and sometimes they need to look at outside organizations. That's not uncommon to have to reach out. I mean, you may be reaching out to find your way, but they need to reach out too. So they really need to explore that. In the same breath, the employee needs to make a good faith effort too. So that means that, if you need to get medical documentation for them, you can't, and they need it within 5 days to get this process going. You can't just say, oh, well, I couldn't get a hold of them, I'm not able to get it. You have to work and try to work with them too, right? So you have to do your part in this. And there are court cases where employers have won because the employee didn't make their good faith effort to work with the employer on a reasonable accommodation. So they are going to determine, when you request an accommodation, they're going to determine whether you're a qualified employee with an ADA disability. That's pretty common to make sure you can still do the skills, knowledge, and ability that you need to do the job. But they're also going to learn about, limitations, functional limitations that you have, any kind of barriers that you have, and how it's affecting you at work. Now, sometimes, if your disability is not obvious, that's usually when they want you to prove that you have an ADA disability. But if it's obvious, then they generally shouldn't be asking you to, prove you have an ADA disability. Because again, the focus is not on whether you have an ADA disability, but whether they can reasonably accommodate you. Let's see here. And then they'll find out, sometimes this is when you get an opportunity to give them some of your accommodation ideas. And then they'll talk about, what accommodation ideas they think may be able to help. They're able to, this is after they request an accommodation, they can ask questions about your medical condition, but it should all be related to your functional limitations, not about, oh, so how long have you had diabetes? How bad is your diabetes? When does it, it should be focused on your job and how those functional limitations as a result of that health condition can be overcome, right? So, the interactive process, so when you request an accommodation, one accommodation normally doesn't last forever. You either get better, you get sick, you get an additional health condition, it changes. So don't feel like you can't go back after you request an accommodation and let them know it's not working, or if you need another one. I mean, a lot of people right now, because of COVID-19, are actually having to ask for additional accommodations or asking for different ones, or for the first time having to ask for one. It's not uncommon at all. Now, where they don't have to provide a reasonable accommodation, and I don't want to go real deep into this because I don't want to scare you, but there is undue hardship. This is when there's financial difficulty or it's unduly disruptive to reasonably accommodate you in your position. It is a very, very high bar for employers to meet that, to not reasonably accommodate you in your current position. And even if they can't accommodate you because of an undue hardship, they need to look to see if there's alternative positions. Normally, the companies that can actually do the undue hardship are actually smaller firms, right? Because smaller firms don't have the resources like the bigger firms. Like a smaller firm, if you need a, let's say an elevator, they probably, financially to put in an elevator could cost, $15,000. So that probably may not be something they could, financially do. But I don't want you to worry about that. I don't want you to not request an accommodation because you're concerned about that, okay? There is a lot that they have to do on their side to determine that. And there's a lot of outside resources that can help them. So don't worry about that. I want you to go ahead and request something if you feel like you need it. Direct threat. So that's another reason why they may deny you an accommodation. And this is a direct threat is a health or safety risk to you or others. So let's say a machine operator has seizures but have been under control for a long time. But let's say his seizures have gotten worse and the seizure medicine he uses that controls the seizures causes him to be dizzy and, kind of spacey. Well, in that way, that he would have to have a medical evaluation first. They wouldn't just do it on opinion to decide whether it was a direct threat. But after a medical evaluation, they find that it would be a direct threat to themselves or others, then, he wouldn't be qualified for that position anymore. But they would have to look for other positions. But again, I don't want you to worry about that. I just want you to know those are some words that you may hear, but they will do things first to, find out if there's other options for you. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're at what you should do if you need to request an accommodation. This is what you've been waiting for, right? Is, okay, how do I request it? I know that I fall underneath all this. I need to request it. What do I do? Now, these 4 points that I suggest you do is only when you have time to do it. So in an emergency situation, let's say that it's immediate leave and you end up in the hospital and you need to take leave, and of course you're incapacitated, you can't reach your doctor. Well, your family member or your doctor can contact them and let them know you're on leave, right? You can follow up with whatever information they need later, right? So you're not going to have time to research it. Another one, you're probably not going to have to research something like I was talking about if you have, a migraine and that a lamp, helps you. So, you're not going to have to go through that process. And also, if you have a more informal relationship with your manager and open, and let's say they already know that you have a current health condition and it's more of a discussion, then you don't have to do that. And then, and a lot of times too, a lot of people don't know that, requesting accommodation sometimes is not, you don't need it because of your current ADA disability, but it's because of the symptoms related to your assistive devices, like medication. Like sometimes medication has worse symptoms than your current, health condition. So it may be that you're requesting an accommodation, because your medication is making it hard for you to concentrate or focus. So I just wanted to put that in there, that you can, it doesn't have to be your health condition per se, but it can be something that's helping you with your health condition that's causing you issues that you need an accommodation for. Okay, but let's say that you have the time and you want to process and request an accommodation. You've got some time to do it. I'm going to show you how to do that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so first you want to do your research, and this is if possible, right? I don't want you to get too stressed about this. This is not your responsibility to do your research, but think about this. If somebody comes to me with a health condition I'm not familiar with, that I don't know much about, I have never had experience with it, it's going to be really hard for me to, at first, like wrap my head around how am I going to help you, right? So the more information you can provide them about the assisted devices or what you think will help you overcome. Again, not about the details about your medical condition, but what type of barriers you're experiencing and what type of accommodations may help you. It's going to go a long way for that employer to help you, right? So again, being on both sides, HR and an employee, it's scary for both. Believe me, it's like, I remember, I have to admit, when before I got in the wreck and all this stuff happened, every time I'd have an ADA issue, and this is in 2004, so remember, we don't have the laws and processes we have in place. I'm just like, oh, because I was fearful, right? I wasn't sure how to deal with this, so you have to understand sometimes the reactions you're getting from the managers, especially because they're not always trained well, is to understand kind of where they're coming from. A little bit of empathy doesn't mean you have to tolerate any appropriate, but just realize you're both are kind of a little fearful, right? Because the manager is responsible for his team and making a profit. So the more information you can provide them, it's going to make it a little bit better. And employers right now are really trying to up their education level with their managers and HR and their company. So they're still in the process. So it's okay if you actually know more than your manager. It's okay. And there's ways you do it to be respectful, right? You're just going to give them the information that's going to help them help you. So you want to look if your employer has an ADA policy. If they do have an ADA policy, and let's say they say, you need to request it from your manager, but you don't feel comfortable with your manager, you can request it from somebody else in upper management. That's okay. So don't feel like you can't request it from someone else. Also, look at your healthcare provider. So if you're going on medical leave, of course, your healthcare provider is going to tell you how much medical leave you need. But also, let's say, a lot of people who go to physical therapists, occupational therapists, chiropractic, all those are healthcare providers. So it's just not your primary care doctor. So it's anybody who is taking care of your health that can provide, information confirming your ADA disability or ideas for accommodations. So let's say someone has a stroke and they're numb on like the right side. Well, if they're working with the occupational therapist, they're going to have a lot more information of how maybe accommodation that can help you than your primary care doctor. So I say really rely on those people that can really help you out. And I really even encourage encourage employers to use physical therapists, occupational therapists, ergonomic specialists, because they really do. This is what they do every day. And also reach out to your job accommodation network. They are wonderful. I really like them. I was working with them a lot when I was writing the book and just really impressed with them. In your ADA regional centers, people forget there's ADA regional centers. There's 10 of them. The one here in the Pacific Northwest is the Northwest ADA Center, but there's ones all over, and they're there to help you and to give you ideas and help you through this process. The last thing you want to do, if it has to do with your job, is analyze your job duties. Look at what your current job duties. Now, one thing I'm still encouraging employers, and they're getting better at this, is making sure the job duties are up to date. And sometimes it takes working with your manager, you, and someone that used to be in your position to figure out what the current job duties, and they're changing all the time. So you may look at your job duties and say, oh, but I know this is something I do every day, or this is not something I do that's necessary that I do. But there are one thing to remember about this, essential job function doesn't mean you need to be doing it 80% of the time. But let's say that you are, working in the healthcare field, and, ever so often you need to be able to lift somebody who, let's say, passes out, and you need to lift them. Maybe it's only 1% of the time, but you have to have the ability to lift them. Then that can be an essential function. It doesn't mean something you do 90% of the time, but it may be something that's essential, because if this happens, you need to be able to take over. Okay, next slide, please. So prepare your requests. I know we're going slow on time, but I'm willing to stay here and answer some questions, but I just want to cover this for you guys. So when you're preparing your request, you're going to either decide whether you're going to explain that it's a physical or mental impairment, or that you're going to reveal your diagnosis, okay? So let's say somebody has a brain injury, but they don't want to tell them they have a brain injury because of preconceived ideas, and they tell them they have a neurological impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. That's okay. You can use neurological impairment. And so this person, okay, so we're going to use that as example. Sarah has a neurological impairment. So what major life activities are substantially limited? Her ability to concentrate for long periods of time, her ability to recall information, ability to focus, ability to, I already said concentrate. So what limitations is she experiencing? Sensitivity to light, memory loss, forgetting tasks when they need to be completed, eye pain and headaches from lighting, easily distracted by noise and talking around the individual. Do you see how I'm creating the story so your employer's starting to understand kind of what your challenges are? Now, what kind of ideas do you have that may help you? Well, I know that if we change the lighting, it could help, warmer light, written checklist of tasks that I need to do, maybe setting it up on the computer reminders, maybe a white noise machine or headphones, or even a change in location. So it doesn't mean, sometimes when you're requesting accommodation, you're not sure. That's so common, right? And you may go through 2 or 3 accommodations before you get the right one. That's okay. I want you to say that's okay. But you can give them ideas of helping, and then you guys are going to negotiate what you're going to try first. So how do you think these accommodations will help you overcome limitations? Well, it's going to help you complete all your tasks daily on time. It's going to reduce my eye strain while I'm working, so I'm able to complete my work. I'm going to be able to concentrate and complete projects. So see how you're selling them on the accommodations you're requesting? We're always selling ourselves. That's just us at work. We're always showing how we benefit the company. When you're interviewing, you're doing the same thing. Next slide, please. So the third is request an accommodation. You can do this verbally or in writing. I do encourage you to do it writing, or if you do it verbally, to follow up in writing, because you do want documentation of when you request the accommodation, just in case there's a change in management or something. I do recommend that you use the words request for a reasonable accommodation under the ADA. You are not required to do that. But I really encourage people to do that, because this puts employers on notice. And I can't tell you how many times I get employers saying, well, don't they have to use the words request for a reasonable accommodation for us to have to, engage in the interactive process? No, there's other ways that they can ask for accommodations that don't use that words, but it just makes it more difficult. And I want, my goal is for employer and employee to work together for the best outcome for both. Okay. So if you can use those words, I do suggest you use them. And then in your letter, you're going to briefly or verbally, you're going to briefly describe your physical or mental impairment related to your disability or diagnosis, whichever you decide, that are affecting your work. That's your ability to perform your job or access your employer's facilities or engage in programs or events. And then you're going to explain the limitations and restrictions or workplace barriers you're experiencing in major life activities. Is it sitting, reading, hearing, concentrating, and that are substantially or difficult and making it hard for you to work? So I'm going to give you an example of, again, MS. There's so many people with MS. That's why I use that example, and it relates to a lot of chronic health conditions. So this is my letter, okay? I have multiple sclerosis and autoimmune disorder, which is a physical impairment affecting my immune system. Now, if you didn't want to put MS, you could put, I have an autoimmune disorder, which is a physical impairment that affects my immune system, if you don't want to use that. I'm experiencing physical limitations that are impacting my ability to perform the essential functions of my job. As an engineer, I use my computer 90% of the time. Lately, I've had greater difficulty typing and using the mouse because of numbness and tingling in my hands. I am also having difficulty sitting for long periods of time and eye strain from focusing on the computer all day, which increases my overall fatigue and pain. And so you're going to provide accommodation ideas. Now you're going to say, I would like to request a modification in my work equipment, which I think may help me overcome some of the limitations I'm experiencing and using the computer and sitting for long periods of time. So my suggestions are a sit-stand desk so that I can alternate between sitting and standing, an ergonomic mouse and keyboard, a text-to-speech software to use when I'm unable to keep up with the reading and the research I need to do for my position due to the fatigue and eye strain, and an adjustable cushion chair. So see how this really helps put that picture in your employer's mind of what it is you need, what your challenges are, and what you need. You're not going into the detail of your health condition. You're just going into the barriers and ideas you have to overcome those. One of the things I do suggest you do is then you want to ask for their employer's accommodation ideas. You want to show that you're flexible and cooperative, and that your main goal is to find the best way to perform your essential job functions. It also shows you're making an effort to find an accommodation that works for both you and your employer. So, not only are you giving them ideas, but you're asking them for ideas. Again, this is a teamwork. It really is. It takes a team to do this, meaning you and your employer. And then you're going to ask your employer when you expect to hear back from them. And then you're going to document. Always document. Really important, because miscommunication can happen. And the last thing, next slide, please, is engaging in the interactive process. So once you request it, you're going to engage in the interactive process in good faith, like we talked about. You're going to talk about how it benefits you and your employer, the accommodation you're requesting. And an employer does not have to provide the exact accommodation you request, but they do have to provide something just as effective. And a lot of times this comes into play when it comes to cost, right? And sometimes, they may ask you to do an accommodation. You're like, I'm not sure that's going to work. Try to work with them, try it, document what works and doesn't work, because it's going to help them kind of work from that. And then, if you are having a problem getting medical documentation from your doctor, then you want to let them know, communicate that you're having difficulty, and let them know that you're trying more. Just communicate, because it is becoming a problem right now for a lot of employees getting information from their doctor. So you just want to make sure you communicate what you're trying to make that work. And remember, this is not uncommon to try and try again, that you need to try different accommodations. The key is that communication, staying on top of it and letting them know as soon as possible if it's not working for you. Also, it's like, well, when do I disclose this? Many people, you can disclose it during the interview process or once you've been offered the job. A lot of people are afraid to do that, but you can. But if you wait, don't wait until it affects your performance. If you're noticing it's starting to affect your performance, request an accommodation as soon as possible, because once they write up any kind of verbal counseling or written counseling or your performance review, they do not have to rescind that because you're requesting accommodation. So make sure you do it before it actually affects your performance and it's not documented, right? And confidentiality, a lot of people are worried about who knows. Well, none of your coworkers are going to know. It's on a need-to-know basis. So the only people are going to know is the manager, HR, or anybody involved in processing that. But even that's limited. It's limited to the functional limitations and the accommodations. It's not the detail of your disability and stuff, right? And, it's going to be up to you whether you want to tell your, teammates or not. I say sometimes you want to because they understand you better, and sometimes you don't want them to. But that's really up to you, and you have to think about that. And disclosure is a whole different, thing you want to think about. But don't wait until it starts affecting your performance, because, like I said, they don't have to rescind your performance, if there's something wrong with it, if you hadn't requested an accommodation. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's it. I hope that provided you, hope it didn't overwhelm you. I'm hoping it provided you with, if you do this, your employer is going to be so happy with you to be provided that information, because it's really going to help them help you. And I would say 90% of HR people I know, they're in this job to help people, but it gets really overwhelming when, especially right now, a lot of them are overwhelmed with so many people needing accommodations because of COVID-19. So if you can come in with a plan or some sort of information, it's really going to help everybody out. And the QR code there is for my website. If you just want to makes it easier for do that, you can email me at my email address there. And I just put the link on Amazon if you wanted to look at that. And again, if you get the book, you can download the paperwork for the workbook. Some people like the workbook because they can actually take that into their employer and talk to them about it. And you can do a job analysis in there. But, again, this book is not something, it's not an us against them. This is about working together. So if you want to bring in the book and talk to them about it, or the workbook, that's fine. There's nothing in there that's going to, I've been on both sides. So any way to help you guys, I just want to give everybody the tools that I didn't have when I went through this. So I'm open to questions or comments or